Hey guys, top of the morning to you. My name's Adam Swenson, and this is my first video on population density and how it forms us and shapes our growing up and our opinions about things. First things first, this channel is meant to be friendly, not political, not partisan, not divisive, friendly philosophical chats. I was a philosophy major in college, philosophy and theology, and philosophy, for any of you who don't know the origin of the word, or the word actually means the love of wisdom, and I think wisdom is, we have a lot of rhetoric right now and a lot of talking points and in our society, and probably not as much wisdom as we should have, and so certainly not saying I have the corner on that, but hopefully I can get us started with some springboards and some discussion. So yeah, what I wanted to talk about today is population density and how that forms your view of the world. I got onto this from a lady named Shannon Welch, who posted a YouTube, or a Facebook essay that was, I have not had my morning coffee yet, so I apologize for any misspeaking. And it's very, very important part of philosophy is coffee. I will tell you that this right here is the correct color for coffee. It's, you notice that no light can escape from one side to the other. That's how it's supposed to be. Anyway, Shannon Welch, Facebook. It's kicking in, and so she talked about population density and how you view the world, and asked, what's the population density you grew up in, what's the population density where you live now? So I grew up in Menominee, Wisconsin, which has a population density of 1,100 people per square mile. I live now in St. Paul, Minnesota, which has a population density of about 6,000 people per square mile. Now, for context, she wrote about her thinking on this was really springboarded when she went to Mumbai, India, and that has a population density of 75,000 people per square mile. So she said basically walking down the sidewalk is like being in the front row of a concert. Like, it's just a teeming mass of humanity. There's no such thing as personal space. Basically, humanity moves in a direction. Like, you're in a lane, almost like a lane of traffic, and you get into it when you are going in that direction, and when you need to get out, you kind of move to the corner and you exit. And so in Mumbai, there's a huge sense of humanity as kind of a big interconnected network, and it's not so much the notion of me and myself and my space and my rights and how dare you bump into me, as it is that I'm one part of many, many millions, and I need to, keep my head down, stay in my lane, so to speak. And it's very different from an American mentality, and so that's what got her thinking about this. I loved the essay. I mean, you should absolutely look it up. It's on Facebook. Her name's Shannon Welch. And what really got me thinking about this is, so I grew up in a town of 1,100 people. I now live in a city of 6,000 per square mile. I've lived up to a population density of like 9,000 when I lived in Minneapolis, in a very urban, incredibly diverse neighborhood. But I've also had experience in Bush, Alaska, where the population density you'd say would be somewhere under 50 people per square mile. One of the interesting things here, one of the things I found really compelling, as Shannon noted in her essay, was that there's a real divide between Republican and people who vote Republican, people who vote Democrat based on population density, which, I mean, as we all know, you look at the map, and it's all the densely populated is the blue area, and the flyover country, quote unquote, is the red. And so where's the cutoff? So it turns out that the more low population density is strongly Republican, more high population density is strongly Democrat. The cutoff is around 800 people per square mile. is about where the trend starts to turn. 800 people per square mile would be like your kind of small to medium-sized Midwestern town. And so you get more than that. Like I said, St. Paul is 6,000. Then you're getting into cities, and you're getting into people who think more in terms of like a whole and a collective, as opposed to thinking about the individual and the rights of the individual. Now, so here would be characteristics of someone who lives in low population density. If you live in low population density area, your access to natural resources and the natural resources around you are likely much, much higher. If there are fewer people and you're in more of a wild area or more farm country, then you've got more access to land, you've got more access to wood. If you need to catch fish or hunt animals for your food, that is more of a practical thing and maybe more even of a need. Your accesses to services are much lower depending on where you live, obviously. Some places out in rural Alaska, say if you call 911, you might get someone like a day later because they have to catch a flight out, and the flight might be the mountain pass might be fogged in. So 911 is not what you think of for your first approach. Same with if you need a medical specialist, they're probably not in your area. Another thing that goes with lower population density would be the question of how do you exercise, right? You probably get the exercise you need by doing the chores necessary to stay alive. If you have to heat with wood, then you have to cut wood and you have to split wood and you've got to do all that stuff. If you've got to maintain all your own vehicles, if you've got to grow your own food, all those things are kind of go back to a historical era when people really did have to do everything for themselves. So the DIY factor is very, very high, and the lower the population density you live in, the more the DIY factor is high. So like I said, with experience in Alaska is called the last frontier, and for a good reason. This little bush village that I stayed in when I was 15 and 16, one of the tasks we had to do was take a boat out, and we'd put out this net where the salmon would run, and the salmon would be basically turning this corner from this river to this lake, and so the salmon would hit this dip, or this net that was out from the shore all the way out. There's a buoy out on the end, and then there were all these corks, and when a salmon would hit the net, then that cork would kind of drop down, and so you could see about how many salmon were in the net when you pulled up to it and you're going to pull the boat underneath, and you'd see how many of these corks were down. So one day we pulled up, it was me and I was 15, and we had another 13-year-old and a 15-year-old, something like that. There were 3 of us in this boat, and we pulled up, and you could see the rope coming off the beach, and you could see the buoy out on the end, and all of the corks were down. And so we put the net over the top of the boat, and we started pulling these salmon out, and we pulled like 100 salmon out of that net, and we were in a little 16-foot boat, to the point that we were worried if the boat was going to swamp or if the boat was going to make it back, and we started going back, and we had some choppy waves to deal with, but it was 1990. None of us had cell phones. We were a few miles away from where we needed to get to, and we had to just start making decisions as young teens. And so the question is, how serious do we think is the risk of swamping, and do we want to throw salmon overboard to save ourselves? And that is the absolute last resort. So we had to figure out to keep the boat on a course, and to stay closer to shore, and to bail, and eventually we made it back safely. Opposite perspective, high population density, more like where I live now. You have a much lower access to natural resources. This area there's nothing frontier about where I live now, I'll tell you that. This area has been pretty well settled. If I wanted to go and cut down a tree to burn in my fireplace, I'm not really sure where I would do that safely and not get a ticket or thrown in jail. In terms of the services that are available here, pretty high. If you need a medical specialist, you can find one. If you need a clinic, there's one that's less than 10 minutes away. If you we got a Costco that's 10 minutes away, so you can buy all the food you'd ever need. If you need a specialist school, we have that. That's just part of what comes along with living in a city. And so when you live in a city, when there's typically more, there's also access to higher paying jobs, so people have more income. And so the need to do it yourself becomes a lot lower, and honestly the practicality of doing it yourself becomes a lot lower, and therefore you learn who you need to call if something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, you call your plumber, or you call your fill in the blank. And if you need to order something, you can order it on Amazon and get it the next day. You can drive to Costco, which is 10 minutes away, and buy it. There's almost nothing that can't be solved with money. And in a lot of these, the more rural the situation that you're in, there's almost nothing that can be solved with money. And so you think back to, almost frontier times where when people were settling and when people were coming to the U.S. and moving across the plains and all that, it was just extreme DIY. And so low population densities are still kind of that area. So you think of things like, how do you exercise in the city? You go to the gym. As soon as I'm done filming this, I'm gonna head to Anytime Fitness, which is literally 24 hours around the clock. You swipe your little key fob and you go in, and I'm gonna head to Anytime Fitness before I go to church, and I'm gonna exercise because I'm in the city, and that's kind of just what you got to do. But I may, if I go on the treadmill and I turn on the TV, I may watch somebody up in Alaska who's chopping wood and living in the wilderness, which is what I may prefer to be doing. So, one good thing though about living in the city is we do have access to tons of good authentic restaurants, and I can go 5 minutes from my house and go to a restaurant where the menu's in Spanish, and I love that about my neighborhood. That gives a 2 big thumbs up from me. So how does this affect our perspective? Of course, the way that we see the world, the way that we have to do things, the way that we cope with daily life strongly informs our value structure, what we're going to vote for, just how we see the world. And so you think about, I'll take 3 different issues. One is guns, one is masks, now that we're in the COVID area, and then one is vehicles. And so guns, for example, in St. Paul, if I hear gunfire, that's, I think, immediately gang violence. There's 6,000 people per square mile here. There's nowhere to shoot a gun, nor is it legal. And I would say the only maybe good reason to do that would be, really, really strong case of defense of, home and or a loved one, something like that. Now, where I grew up in Menominee, guns are used for deer hunting and pheasant hunting and squirrel hunting and yada yada. And farmers use guns for pest control, and so there's all kinds of valid reasons to shoot guns. Guns are a very valid part of the culture, and then there's, you do target shooting and that kind of thing so that you're ready for deer hunting and you can be an ethical sportsman. Now, you go out to rural Alaska, and guns are really, truly a necessary tool to protect yourself from wild animals, protect yourself from bears, but you also need guns to harvest moose, harvest caribou, and that's a main food source. If you live in really rural Alaska, you can shoot 3 moose, sometimes 7 caribou, depending on the area you live and what the regulations are there. But I'm just saying, you can literally harvest a ton of meat and or more, and the gun, your rifle, is your very trusted and very necessary tool. It's a very, very necessary part of life. And so guns in Alaskan culture are seen as just needed. I mean, seen as like same as you'd look at a vehicle or a hammer or a drill or something. It's a tool that you need to do a job. And of course there's people appreciate guns and what they do in that context, and so there's a whole culture that's kind of around it. But you can see where those two things, someone who has grown up in the city and that's really all they've ever known, and someone who's from rural Alaska, if they have a gun conversation, they're going to be going like this and really missing each other. And it's totally understandable. And so also, you know, you look at something like, we're in the COVID era right now, and so you look at the issue of masks, and basically, you know, masks are a pretty political issue right now. And as Shannon pointed out in her essay, that people who live in cities tend to say, hey, masks are needed, we need to do this. And if you need to run errands, if you're more likely to walk than you are to hop in a car, then that population is more likely to say, hey, we need masks. And that's very understandable, because if I'm going to the store to get food and I'm going to walk by 500 people, any of which may have COVID and could cough on me, then I'm going to feel better about the situation if people are wearing masks. Now, if I live in a small town and I'm going to hop in my truck and drive to the supermarket and see a handful of people that I know, and they, you know, everybody kind of stays within this little self-contained area where the risk of COVID is very low and the expansion is very low, then I'm going to think dimly of the need to wear a mask, because it's a relatively much lower threat. Also, I've noticed really with vehicles, an Alaskan perspective on vehicles is often that they are, again, a tool. And so having a vehicle that's beat up, that has dents, that has you know, bigger tires that can get you off-road, that has a bull bar on the front so you can, you know, plow your way through brush, that's just a completely normal thing. And if you live in an area where resources are scarce, like that bush village I lived in, you had to fly vehicles in on a plane. So you don't get rid of a vehicle until you have used every last ounce of use that thing has in it. And so vehicles, you could be using something that's very old. Now the total opposite perspective is, I want a car that can get me around. There's a million cars that can do that. I want a car that's gonna, you know, look good, I'll feel okay driving through my neighborhood. I don't want to have any problems with it, therefore I'm gonna lease a new car and I'm gonna trade it in when it's 3 years old, because I have the money. There are those cars available. I don't want to have any problems, because that's just kind of part of how I view things, and so I'm going to go lease a car. And that's a perfectly fine choice to make. It's just a very different choice to make, because it's almost the mentality of a renter versus someone who's an owner. So I think partly because of my experience in Alaska, my wife and I joke that we drive luxury beaters, because we buy cheap cars, but we always get you know, leather seats and heated seats and all that stuff, because I'm in an area where I have access to tons and tons of vehicles, and a lot of people here might see, you know, we're in 2020 now, so like my wife's vehicle is a 2005, I guess, Acura MDX, and they might see that as kind of used up because it's 15 years old. Well, it still runs and drives perfectly fine, and we got a good deal on it, and so I'm happy with that. And I'll drive it until the wheels fall off, because that's part of how I view things. So I see that there's a sort of a hole in the market there that I can take advantage of, because a lot of people don't want to, you know, maintain stuff. So what do we do about all this? I think if you grew up in a city, there's a real value to going someplace where you can't get deliveries from Amazon Prime you know, same day or next day. There's where you may or may not have cell service all the time, where you have to really think and be resourceful. I've had, I lead mission trips up in Alaska for part of my job, and so I've had students come up to help, college students come out to help out who are, you know, suburban kids, and I say, hey, in Alaska we do this and this and this, and you kind of see them, the wheels turning a little bit, and then the kind of light bulb goes on, and I say, okay. And then you have to be a lot more resilient. You have to figure things out on your own. If you're somebody who grew up in a low population density and you can go and experience a high population density for a while, I think it's an incredibly good and enriching perspective and something you really should think about. So, I know it's been a long conversation. I hope that you guys got something of value out of this. I think it's interesting. I like to try to keep my mind sharp, and so that's part of why I'm doing this. Hopefully you guys find it helpful. Stay tuned. We got a few more videos coming up. One of the next things is a buddy of mine who, in his journey to beat cancer, he started building custom electric guitars and is doing a really awesome job of that. He goes over each one with fire before he builds it, and the look of these is awesome. Bull Moose guitars, that's Pete Sherry. And then I've got another video coming up with a couple guys actually from the neighborhood here who used to be rival gang members and who eventually got tired of shooting at each other and sat down and kind of put their heads together and made a business plan and opened a soul food restaurant. So I'm super excited to talk to those guys and maybe be a sous chef for a little bit and eat some fantastic food. So a few things that are coming up. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Don't forget to, what's the words? We gotta like, comment, and subscribe.